Chapter 4 of Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Terence Callan. Chapter 4 Philip Hepburn. The coast on that part of the island to which this story refers is bordered by rocks and cliffs. The inland country immediately adjacent to the coast is level, flat, and bleak. It is only where the long stretch of dike-enclosed fields terminates abruptly in a sheer descent, and the stranger sees the ocean creeping up the sands far below him, that he is aware on how great an elevation he has been. Here and there, as I have said, a cleft in the level land, thus running out into the sea in steep promontories, occurs, what they would call a chine in the Isle of Wight, but instead of the soft south wind stealing up the woody ravine as it does there, the eastern breeze comes piping shrill and clear along these northern chasms, keeping the trees that venture to grow on the sides down to the mere height of scrubby brushwood. The descent to the shore through these bottoms is in most cases very abrupt, too much so for a cartway or even a bridle path, but people can pass up and down without difficulty by the help of a few rude steps hewn here and there out of the rock. 60 or 70 years ago, not to speak of much later times, the farmers who owned or hired the land which lay directly on the summit of these cliffs were smugglers to the extent of their power, only partially checked by the Coast Guard distributed at pretty nearly equal interspaces of 8 miles, all along the northeastern seaboard. Still, sea wrack was a good manure, and there was no law against carrying it up in great osier baskets for the purpose of tillage, and many a secret thing was lodged in hidden crevices in the rocks till the farmer sent trusty people down to the shore for a good supply of sand and seaweed for his land. One of the farms on the cliff had lately been taken by Sylvia's father. He was a man who had roamed about a good deal, been sailor, smuggler, horse-dealer, and farmer in turns, a sort of fellow possessed by a spirit of adventure and love of change, which did him and his own family more harm than anybody else. He was just the kind of man that all his neighbors found fault with, and all his neighbors liked. Late in life, for such an imprudent man as he was one of a class who generally wed, trusting to chance and luck for the provision for a family, Farmer Robson married a woman whose only want of practical wisdom consisted in taking him for a husband. She was Philip Hepburn's aunt, and had had the charge of him until she married from her widowed brother's house. He it was who had let her know when Haytersbank Farm had been to let, esteeming it a likely piece of land for his uncle to settle down upon, after a somewhat unprosperous career of horse-dealing. The farmhouse lay in the shelter of a very slight green hollow scarcely scooped out of the pasture field by which it was surrounded. The short, crisp turf came creeping up to the very door and windows, without any attempt at a yard or garden, or any nearer enclosure of the buildings than the stone dike that formed the boundary of the field itself. The buildings were long and low, in order to avoid the rough violence of the winds that swept over that wild, bleak spot, both in winter and summer. It was well for the inhabitants of that house that coal was extremely cheap. Otherwise a southerner might have imagined that they could never have survived the cutting of the bitter gales that piped all round and seemed to seek out every crevice for admission into the house. But the interior was warm enough when once you had mounted the long bleak lane, full of round rough stones, enough to lame any horse unaccustomed to such roads, and had crossed the field by the little dry hard footpath which tacked about so as to keep from directly facing the prevailing wind. Mrs. Robson was a Cumberland woman, and as such was a cleaner housewife than the farmers' wives of that northeastern coast, and was often shocked at their ways, showing it more by her looks than by her words, for she was not a great talker. This fastidiousness in such matters made her own house extremely comfortable, but did not tend to render her popular among her neighbors. Indeed, Belle Robson piqued herself on her housekeeping generally, and once indoors in the gray, bare stone house, there were plenty of comforts to be had besides cleanliness and warmth. The great rack of clapbread hung overhead, and Belle Robson's preference of this kind of oatcake over the leavened and partly sour kind used in Yorkshire was another source of her unpopularity. Flitches of bacon and hands, that is, shoulders of cured pork, the legs or hams being sold as fetching a better price, abounded, and for any visitor who could stay, neither cream nor finest wheaten flour was wanting for turf cakes and singing hinnies, with which it is the delight of the northern housewives to regale the honored guest, as he sips their high-priced tea, sweetened with dainty sugar. This night Farmer Robson was fidgeting in and out of his house door, climbing the little eminence in the field, and coming down disappointed in a state of fretful impatience. His quiet, taciturn wife was a little put out by Sylvia's non-appearance too, but she showed her anxiety by being shorter than usual in her replies to his perpetual wonders as to where the lass could have been tarrying, and by knitting away with extra diligence. "I've a vast a mind to go down to Monkshaven mysen, and see after t' child. It's well on for 7. "No, Dan'l," said his wife, "thou'd best not. Thy leg has been paining thee this week past, and thou'rt not up to such a walk. I'll rouse Kester, and send him off, if thou think'st there's need on it." "I'll noan ha' Kester roused. Who's to go afield betimes after t' sheep into morn, if he's caught up to neat? He'd miss t' lass and find a public house, a reckon," said Daniel querulously. "I'm not afeard o' Kester," replied Belle. "He's a good one for knowing folk in the dark. But if thou'd rather, I'll put on my hood and cloak, and just go to the end of the lane, if thou'lt have an eye to the milk, and see as it doesna boil o'er, for she canna stomach it if it's bishoped e'er so little." Before Mrs. Robson, however, had put away her knitting, voices were heard at a good distance down the lane, but coming nearer every moment, and once more Daniel climbed the little brow to look and to listen. "It's a' reet," said he, hobbling quickly down. "Niver fidget thysel' wi' getting ready to go search for her. I'll tak thee a bet it's Philip Hepburn's voice, convoying her home, just as I said he would an hour sin." Belle did not answer, as she might have done, that this probability of Philip's bringing Sylvia home had been her own suggestion, set aside by her husband as utterly unlikely. Another minute, and the countenances of both parents imperceptibly and unconsciously relaxed into pleasure as Sylvia came in. She looked very rosy from the walk and the October air, which began to be frosty in the evenings. There was a little cloud over her face at first, but it was quickly dispersed as she met the loving eyes of home. Philip, who followed her, had an excited but not altogether pleased look about him. He received a hearty greeting from Daniel and a quiet one from his aunt. "Tak off thy pan o' milk, missus, and set on to kettle. Milk may do for wenches, but Philip and me is for a drop o' good Hollands and water this cold night. I'm a'most chilled to-morrow, wi' looking out for thee, lass, for t' mother was in a peck o' troubles about thy none coming home into dayleet, and I'd to keep hearkening out on t' Browhead." This was entirely untrue, and Belle knew it to be so, but her husband did not. He had persuaded himself now, as he had done often before, that what he had in reality done for his own pleasure or satisfaction, he had done in order to gratify someone else. The town was rough with a riot between the press gang and the whaling folk, and I thought I'd best see Sylvia home. Aye, aye, lad, always welcome, if it's only as an excuse for to liquor. But to whalers, say'st-ta? Why, is to whalers in? There was none in sight yesterday, when I were down on to shore. It's early days for 'em as yet, and to cursed old press gang's agate again, doing its devil's work. His face changed as he ended his speech, and showed a steady passion of old hatred. Aye, missus, you may look. I wunna pick and choose my words, no other for you nor for nobody, when I speak of that domned gang. I'm none ashamed of my words. They're true, and I'm ready to prove 'em. Where's my forefinger? Aye, and as good a top joint of a thumb as iver a man had. I wished I'd kept 'em in spirits, as they done things at Potticary, just to show to lass what flesh and bone I made away with to get free. I ups wi' a hatchet when I saw as I were fast aboard a man-o'-war standing out for sea. It were into time of the war wi' America, and I couldna stomach the thought of being murdered in my own language. So I ups wi' a hatchet, and I says to Bill Watson, says I, now, my lad, if thou'll do me a kindness, I'll pay thee back, never fear, and they'll be glad enough to get shut on us, and send us to old England again. Just come down with a will. Now, missus, why can't ye sit still and listen to me, 'stead of pottering after pans and what not, said he, speaking crossly to his wife, who had heard the story scores of times, and, it must be confessed, was making some noise in preparing bread and milk for Sylvia's supper. Bell did not say a word in reply, but Sylvia tapped his shoulder with a pretty little authoritative air. It's for me, feyther. I'm just keen set for my supper. Once let me get quickly set down to it, and Philip there to his glass of grog, and you'll never have such listeners in your life, and mother's mind will be at ease too. Thou's a wilful wench, said the proud father, giving her a great slap on her back. Well, set thee down to thy victual, and be quiet with thee, for I want to finish my tale to Philip. But perhaps I've telled it to you afore, said he, turning round to question Hepburn. Hepburn could not say that he had not heard it, for he piqued himself on his truthfulness. But instead of frankly and directly owning this, he tried to frame a formal little speech, which would soothe Daniel's mortified vanity, and of course it had the directly opposite effect. Daniel resented being treated like a child, and yet turned his back on Philip with all the willfulness of one. Sylvia did not care for her cousin, but hated the discomfort of having her father displeased. So she took up her tale of adventure and told her father and mother of her afternoon's proceedings. Daniel pretended not to listen at first, and made ostentatious noises with his spoon and glass, but by and by he got quite warm and excited about the doings of the press gang, and scolded both Philip and Sylvia for not having learnt more particulars as to what was the termination of the riot. I've been whaling mysel, said he, and I've heerd tell as whalers wear knives, and I'd ha' given t' gang a taste of my whittle if I'd been cotched up just as I'd set my foot ashore. I don't know, said Philip. We're at war with the French, and we shouldn't like to be beaten, and yet if our numbers are not equal to theirs, we stand a strong chance of it. Not a bit on it, so be damned, said Daniel Robson, bringing down his fist with such violence on the round deal table that the glasses and earthenware shook again. You'd not strike a child or a woman for sure, yet it'd be like it if we didna give the Frenchies some vantages, if we took 'em with equal numbers. It's not fair play, and that's one place where to shoe pinches. It's not fair play two ways. It's not fair play to cotch up men as has no call for fightin' at another man's biddin', though they've no objection to fight a bit on their own account, and who are just landed, all keen after bread instead of biscuit, and flesh meat instead of junk, and beds instead of hammocks. I make naught o' to sentiment side, for I were niver given up to such carnal-mindedness and poesies. It's no unfair to cotch 'em up and put 'em in a stifling hole, all lined with metal for fear they should whittle their way out, and send 'em off to sea for years and years to come. And again, it's no fair play to French. 4 of them is rightly matched with 1 of us, and if we go and fight 'em 4 to 4, it's like as if you fell to beatin' Sylvie there, or little Billy Croxton, as isn't breeched, and that's my mind. Missus, where's to pipe?" Philip did not smoke, so took his turn at talking, a chance he seldom had with Daniel unless the latter had his pipe between his lips. So after Daniel had filled it, and used Sylvia's little finger as a stopper to ram down the tobacco, a habit to which she was so accustomed that she laid her hand on the table by him, as naturally as she would have fetched him his spittoon when he began to smoke, Philip arranged his arguments and began. "I'm for fair play with the French as much as any man, as long as we can be sure of beating them. But I say make sure of that, and then give them every advantage. Now I reckon government is not sure as yet, for in the papers it said as half the ships in the Channel hadn't got their proper complement of men. And all I say is, let government judge a bit for us, and if they say they're hampered for want of men, why we must make it up somehow. John and Jeremiah Foster pay in taxes, and militiaman pays in person, and if sailors cannot pay in taxes and will not pay in person, why they must be made to pay, and that's what the press gang is for, I reckon. For my part, when I read of the way those French chaps are going on, I'm thankful to be governed by King George and a British Constitution." Daniel took his pipe out of his mouth at this. "And when did I say a word against King George and the Constitution? I only ax 'em to govern me as I judge best, and that's what I call representation. When I gived my vote to Meester Cholmley to go up to Parliament House, I as good as said, 'Now you go up there, sir, and tell 'em what I, Dan'l Robson, think right, and what I, Dan'l Robson, wish to have done. Else I'd be darned if I'd given my vote to him or any other man. And div you think I want Seth Robson, as is my own brother's son and mate to a collier, to be cotched up by a press gang and 10 to 1 his wages all unpaid? Div you think I'd send up Mr. Cholmley to speak up for that piece of work? Not I." He took up his pipe again, shook out the ashes, puffed it into a spark, and shut his eyes preparatory to listening. "But, asking pardon, laws is made for the good of the nation, not for your good or mine." Daniel could not stand this. He laid down his pipe, opened his eyes, stared straight at Philip before speaking, in order to enforce his words, and then said slowly, "Nation here, nation there. I'm a man and you're another, but nations nowhere. If Mr. Cholmley talked to me in that fashion, he'd look long for another vote frae me. I can make out King George and Maester Pitt and yo and me, but nation, go hang." Philip, who sometimes pursued an argument longer than was politic for himself, especially when he felt sure of being on the conquering side, did not see that Daniel Robson was passing out of the indifference of conscious wisdom into that state of anger which ensues when a question becomes personal in some unspoken way. Robson had contested this subject once or twice before, and had the remembrance of former disputes to add to his present vehemence. So it was well for the harmony of the evening that Belle and Sylvia returned from the kitchen to sit in the house place. They had been to wash up the pans and basins used for supper. Sylvia had privately shown off her cloak, and got over her mother's shake of the head at its color with a coaxing kiss, at the end of which her mother had adjusted her cap with a "There, had done with thee," but had no more heart to show her disapprobation. And now they came back to their usual occupations until it should please their visitor to go. Then they would rake the fire and be off to bed, for neither Sylvia's spinning nor Belle's knitting was worth candlelight, and morning hours are precious in a dairy. People speak of the way in which harp playing sets off a graceful figure, Spinning is almost as becoming an employment. A woman stands at the great wool wheel, one arm extended, the other holding the thread, her head thrown back to take in all the scope of her occupation. Or if it is the lesser spinning wheel for flax, and it was this that Sylvia moved forwards tonight, the pretty sound of the buzzing, whirring motion, the attitude of the spinner, foot and hand alike engaged in the business, the bunch of gay-colored ribbon that ties the bundle of flax on the rock, all make it into a picturesque piece of domestic business that may rival harp-playing any day for the amount of softness and grace which it calls out. Sylvia's cheeks were rather flushed by the warmth of the room after the frosty air. The blue ribbon with which she had thought it necessary to tie back her hair before putting on her hat to go to market had got rather loose, and allowed her disarranged curls to stray in a manner which would have annoyed her extremely if she had been upstairs to look at herself in the glass. But although they were not set in the exact fashion which Sylvia esteemed as correct, they looked very pretty and luxuriant. Her little foot, placed on the traddle, was still encased in its smartly buckled shoe, not slightly to her discomfort, as she was unaccustomed to be shod in walking far. Only as Philip had accompanied them home, neither she nor Molly had liked to go barefoot. Her round, mottled arm and ruddy taper hand drew out the flax with nimble, agile motion, keeping time to the movement of the wheel. All this Philip could see. The greater part of her face was lost to him as she half averted it with a shy dislike to the way in which she knew from past experience that Cousin Philip always stared at her. And avert it as she would, she heard with silent petulance the harsh screech of Philip's chair as he heavily dragged it on the stone floor, sitting on it all the while, and felt that he was moving round so as to look at her as much as was in his power, without absolutely turning his back on either her father or mother. She got herself ready for the first opportunity of contradiction or opposition. "Well, wench, and hast to bought this grand new cloak?" "Yes, feyther, it's a scarlet one." "Aye, aye, and what does mother say?" "Oh, mother's content," said Sylvia, a little doubting in her heart, but determined to defy Philip at all hazards. "Mother'll put up with it if it doesn't a spot would be nearer fact, I'm thinking," said Belle quietly. "I wanted Sylvia to take the gray," said Philip. "And I chose the red. It's so much gayer, and folk can see me the farther off. Feyther likes to see me at first turn o' t' lane, don't you, feyther? And I'll niver turn out when it's bound for to rain, so it shall niver get a spot near it, mammy." "I reckoned it were to wear in bad weather," said Belle. "Leastways, that were the pretext for coaxing feyther out of it." She said it in a kindly tone, though the words became a prudent rather than a fond mother. But Sylvia understood her better than Daniel did, as it appeared. "Hold thy tongue, mother, she niver spoke a pretext at all." He did not rightly know what a pretext was. Belle was a touch better educated than her husband, but he did not acknowledge this, and made a particular point of differing from her whenever she used a word beyond his comprehension. "She's a good lass at times, and if she liked to wear a yellow-orange cloak she should have it. Here's Philip here as stands up for laws and press-gangs. I'll set him to find us a law again pleasing our lass, and she our only one. Thou dostn't think on that, mother." Belle did think of that often, oftener than her husband perhaps, for she remembered every day, and many times a day, the little one that had been born and had died while its father was away on some long voyage. But it was not her way to make replies. Sylvia, who had more insight into her mother's heart than Daniel, broke in with a new subject. "Oh, as for Philip, he's been preaching up laws all to way home. I said naught, but let Molly hold her own, or else I could 'a' told a tale about silks and lace and things." Philip's face flushed. Not because of the smuggling. Everyone did that, only it was considered polite to ignore it. But he was annoyed to perceive how quickly his little cousin had discovered that his practice did not agree with his preaching, and vexed too to see how delighted she was to bring out the fact. He had some little idea too that his uncle might make use of his practice as an argument against the preaching he had lately been indulging in opposition to Daniel. But Daniel was too far gone in his Hollands and water to do more than enunciate his own opinions, which he did with hesitating and labored distinctness in the following sentence. What I think and say is this: laws is made for to keep some folks for harming others. Press gangs and coast guards harm me in my business and keep me from getting what I want. Therefore, what I think and say is this: Meester Chomley should put down press gangs and coast guards. If that there isn't the reason, I ax you to tell me what is. And if Meester Chomley don't do what I ax him, he may go whistle for my vote, he may. At this period in his conversation, Bell Robson interfered. Not in the least from any feeling of disgust or annoyance, or dread of what he might say or do if he went on drinking, but simply as a matter of health. Sylvia, too, was in no way annoyed, not only with her father, but with every man whom she knew, excepting her cousin Philip. Was it a matter of course to drink till their ideas became confused. So she simply put her wheel aside as preparatory to going to bed, when her mother said in a more decided tone than that which she had used on any other occasion but this and similar ones, "Come, meester, you've had as much as is good for you." Let a be, said he, clutching at the bottle of spirits, but perhaps rather more good-humored with what he had drunk than he was before. He jerked a little more into his glass before his wife carried it off and locked it up in the cupboard, putting the key in her pocket. And then he said, winking at Philip, my man, niver gie a woman to whip-hand o'er you. You've seen what it brings a man to, but for all that I'll vote for Chumley, and damn to the press gang. He had to shout out the last after Philip, for Hepburn, really anxious to please his aunt, and disliking drinking habits himself by constitution, was already at the door and setting out on his return home, thinking, it must be confessed, far more of the character of Sylvia's shake of the hand than of the parting words of either his uncle or aunt. End of chapter 4.